All right, let's take a look at this next group of writers here. A name we all recognize, probably Ernest Hemingway. You may have read some of his stuff in high school. I actually didn't. I can't really remember, but read some of it since then. Great writer, especially with his connection with Spain, which is something that I have followed. So his concise writing style contrasts with modernist writers. He has a very brief style, cuts out a lot of the adjectives. You know, you might note that in some of his work. He was a reporter, again, another reporter. We're going to see many more. We've seen many that are connected with newspapers. And this, when you're writing journalistic style, they may have had an influence on how he writes. Here's a picture from here. I think this is the first picture we've seen of somebody without a tie. Yeah. So he was sent to Italy in World War I. And, which is inspired in the novel, it's Farewell to Arms. It describes the relationship between Frederick, an American soldier, and Catherine, a British nurse. So it shows their run from prison and from death, only to end up quiet victims in the end. But definitely influenced by personal experience there. He spent time with other expats in Paris, Ezra Pound, Gertrude Stein, and he wrote about his experiences abroad. And it's interesting to see that there, a lot of the expats that are now spending time in Europe. So for Hemingway, Spain in particular had a strong influence on his writing, and he loved bullfighting. I've never been to a bullfight, and I've lived in Spain many years, but apparently he did. He wrote about San Fermines up in Pamplona, the running of the bulls. I went there a long time ago, and I think there's a statue up there dedicated to him. The Sun Also Rises is about a group of American and British expats living in Paris that go to the San Fermin Festival in Pamplona. So this is, definitely connected to a lot of the things that he lived and that interested him. His love for Spain was evident. He took an interest in the Republican cause in the Spanish Civil War. That was 1936 and 1939. And then in April 1st, 1939, General Francisco Franco had claimed after the coup d'etat victory and was in power until 1975, I think it was. Yes. So he wrote For Whom the Bell Tolls about the International Brigades. The International Brigades were the volunteer international group that came together from all over the world. A lot from Poland, a lot from France, different parts of the world. And somebody wrote once that it was the first time since Charlemagne that a lot of Europe and the world had been brought together for one particular cause, but maybe that's a little bit extreme, but the International Brigades was a group. There's a lot of movies out there about them. And there was the American faction of that, I think, was called the Abe Lincoln Brigade, of Americans that were involved in that. Anyways, so for this, back to this. The main character is Robert Jordan, an American who is assigned to set dynamite under a bridge during an attack on Segovia. Segovia is a bridge outside, or a city outside of Madrid, very beautiful city. And, once again, a lot of personal experience laid out in his novels. The Old Man and the Sea is perhaps his most famous novel. It narrates the story of Santiago, a Cuban fisherman who fights with a giant marlin far off the coast of Florida. And this won him the Pulitzer Prize and also contributed to him winning the Nobel Prize. John Steinbeck, another writer perhaps you may have read in high school. Maybe not. I don't think I did. But his books are, I believe, on some curriculum. So he's a prolific writer with many novels and compilations of short stories. Here's a picture of him. Is that another stamp there? So he's got a diverse style. He wrote comical novels like Cannery Row, which was based on a street there in Monterey, California. When I was out there teaching one summer, I went out to Cannery Row and learned about that connection. He's got epic novels, East of Eden, novellas such as Mice and Men, and his masterpiece, The Grapes of Wrath. So a lot of his narratives take place in Salinas Valley in California. So here we've got a regionalist writer about California. We're really covering a lot of ground here with the regionalist writers. His themes are social justice, human condition, connection to the land, comradeship, marginality, etc. But this whole idea of social justice is interesting in some of his novels. So there's a visible compassion for migrant workers and desire for fair labor conditions. We've seen this in some of the other work beforehand in the realist era, but we've seen issues on race, issues on gender, and once in a while we've come across some of these particular issues that have to do with migrant workers. So he was also a writer of literary naturalism, and once again we've an overlap from before, but we've seen this where his characters cannot rise above their conditions in a universe that doesn't really care about them, on a local level, in their condition of where they are, and an existential level on their own experiences of being. Of Mice and Men is about George Milton and Lenny Small, two migrant ranch workers trying to find work during the Great Depression. As they move from one place in California, searching for jobs they can't get, they run into misfortune and tragedy. Lenny kills his boss's wife and has to run, and George in turn kills Lenny out of mercy. Like I said, it's a required reading in some schools, but it's often targeted by censors because of its language and racist content considered by some. And here we are with The Grapes of Wrath, considered a masterpiece of American literature, also read in schools, sold a lot of copies thus far, 14 million, and he won the Nobel Prize in Literature. It's about Oklahoma folk who head west looking for work. When they get to California, they're faced with too many migrants with the same dreams. There's police corruption, poor working conditions, and it's just kind of same themes that we saw in some of his other work, but definitely it's a writer about California. Richard Wright, a writer of the Harlem Renaissance, very important work here, Native Son. So this is something to research more on. I'm going to talk a bit about it here, but it's very, very interesting in its what it says, how it says it, and the message at the end. But this Native Son points out racial segregation as being just part of American culture, and here he has his stamp dedicated to him. So he writes about African American perspective from a realist and naturalist viewpoint. Once again, a world indifferent and hard to overcome. Before we get to that, we'll take a look at Uncle Tom's Children, a scene inspired by Harriet Beecher Stowe. We have a lot of echoes of previous writers, people that want to take up the theme again, people that want to continue the conversation of some of the previous works. So, back to Native Son. Bigger Thomas, that's the main character's name. He personifies everything white America fears in African Americans. He's a product of racism and economic destitution that America has created. It takes a naturalistic viewpoint, but it exculpates his crimes because it shows that circumstances made him who he is and how he is. And at the end of the novel, that's pointed out. So he's a 20-year-old living in segregated Chicago in the 1930s. He takes a job with Mr. Dalton, who was parading as a philanthropist of African Americans, is also a slumlord. And in the novel, Bigard takes a job as a chauffeur. He socializes with Mary, which I believe is the daughter of the fellow there. And one night, he goes out with her and her boyfriend. He ends up in her bedroom coincidentally and accidentally kills her because he's covering her. I believe he's covering her mouth when someone had come in on her. So he hides her body in the furnace and plays innocent. Further crimes after that. One thing perpetuates itself. Bigger runs, but it's caught. And in court, his lawyer argues that as long as racism persists, there'll be more Biggers out there. So, this idea here is important that, this is not just one person. This is something that's, repeated. And then at the end here, when Bigger comes to light of understanding the situation, what he's become and how white America is to blame and how he's a victim of this system, he thanks circumstances for his enlightenment, which, not really thank, but he comes to terms and understands that, he's conscious of who he is by what's happened, but he's already condemned man in a double sense of the word, as condemned in jail, and also condemned to be what he is by the society which has created him.